This meeting is being recorded.
We are recording this session thanks to Carol's agreement. So you will be able to get it on the Village web and on YouTube. And if you have friends who say, oh, I missed it, I wanted to be part of it, tell them that it is recorded and they will have access to it. But let me remind you all of our thanks. Mary Bloodworth does all our technical support. Judy Berman, of course, does everything else that you can imagine for the Village. We have publicity thanks to May-Jean Daniels and Karen Stuck. And all of that makes Village Voices work. We do have a lineup now in progress for the autumn.
I know.
Okay.
Let me remind you remind you to mute yourself unless you're asking a question. If you are determined that you want to ask a question, but you're not sure you're going to remember it till the end of the presentation, we encourage you to use the chat and write your question down. I'll try to be watching the chat, and when we get to the question and answers, I'll make sure that you get an opportunity. So as I said, we do have the first program already set up. It'll be September 12th. And it is historian Leslie Rowland, who is one of the US experts on the legislation the federal government passed at the end of the Civil War for formerly enslaved people. And she's going to talk about that legislation and how it affects where we are today. So that's the way we're going to kick off September. Now tonight, many of you know Carol Grodzins, and many of you know her, I think, as a biker because she does the bikers affiliate group here at the Village. But she's got a long and extremely interesting career behind her. She was in the Peace Corps. She, as a nurse, was president of a group that looked at family-centric obstetrics. She spearheaded the development of the Massachusetts Committee on a Nuclear Weapons Freeze. She was at the Harvard Institute for International Development in the Food Policy Group. She worked with Ashoka, which she will talk about tonight. She's lived in Thailand. She's taught about social change, and she's going to talk about social entrepreneurship. And social entrepreneurship is certainly something we in the Village prize, because it was Jeff Lewis as a social entrepreneur who brought us together to begin this wonderful adventure that has been the Village. So Carol, the Zoom room is yours to talk about being a social entrepreneur.
Thank you so much. And for all of you at the Village who've helped me with PowerPoint, you tech geniuses, Mary and others. And I want to thank you for inviting me to give this talk, because I rewired at the end of 2009, although I've continued working some, but now as a volunteer for Ashoka and also for the Kennedy School of Government, where I spent 13 years. But going over this information, I went back to look at my notes from Ashoka Fellow panels that I had run to elect new Ashoka Fellows, and I reread a book that's sort of our it's not our Bible, but it was a wonderful big book written in 2004 called How to Change the World, Social Entrepreneurs and the Power of New Ideas, by a man named David Bornstein, who is a journalist who writes for who wrote for the New York Times and New Yorker on social issues, and spent a lot of time with us at Ashoka trying to understand this concept. So I've just been smiling all the last weeks that I've been working on preparing this, and I'd like to thank you and for your interest by showing up tonight. The question is how to solve society's biggest problems and how to change the world and make it a better place for all people. There are obviously serious problems that we face in the world. And more, these social issues, these problems of the environment, of diseases traveling across the world, of violence, of war, of human rights abuses, they cross national boundaries. They don't recognize national boundaries, and they require global solutions. So there are lots of people trying to solve these problems around the world. Some of them are visionaries who are very important, who see the vision of where they live in a new way, of how it could be better, how it could be different. And they're very articulate at explaining this vision. I think Nelson Mandela was such a person, a visionary. There are also activists. And activists, many of you are activists, and you have been able to mobilize citizens to protest, to vote, to clean up the neighborhood, the rivers. And activists are other social change agents often. Then there are people working in local, state, and national organizations like The Village, who are trying to improve the life of a group of people. And then there are religious organizations, which has historically offered social services, support, and who are trying to solve problems in the world. Social workers who find fulfillment in their lives with one person at a time, trying to help them solve a problem in their lives. Then there are government bureaucrats, civil servants. They provide services, they research, they develop programs and legislation, they implement laws. The politicians, we still have some really great politicians who are doing great work. And then more recently, in the social sector, we've had business people come into the sector. And I see this as sort of people who are doing good while they're doing well. They create foundations like the Rockefeller family, the Rockefeller Foundation, the Ford Foundation, which has been very important in innovation around the world. In the private sector, Pierre Omidyar is a great example. He founded eBay. And you may not know this about Pierre or even know his name, but Pierre's wife, Pam, was in love with Pez containers. She loved collecting all the Pez containers from the 50s on. And one day she was saying, I can't find any new ones. And Pierre said, well, why don't you look online? And so with his eBay head, or thinking about this kind of issue, how do you find things? How do people who have something to sell get together with people who want to buy it? And so Pam came back the next day and said, there's nothing about Pez online anywhere. And that was the impetus for creating eBay in the beginning, where you could create this perfect market where people who had something to sell could meet online people who wanted to buy it. But his real love and passion was that while they were online together, they would talk to each other, sort of like the old ham operators used to do. You know, how are you? What's going on where you live? There's how my life is. And creating communities of interest. And so he was very interested in this idea of society and business. And I'll tell you a little bit about him a little bit more later, because he's been very important with Ashoka. The MacArthur Foundation, Open Society Institute, all doing really good work started by a business interest coming into our sector, and of course, the Gates Foundation. The way to understand globally about what's going on with individuals trying to improve the society is that power and resources have historically been dominated in some countries by the private sector, like in most Western nations. In other countries, the public sector, the government, dominates in resources and power, and that's often in the global South. Many people came to believe that a third sector is necessary to balance these other two. And thank you, Mary, for putting on our first slide. Because I call it, and many other people call it now, the citizen sector, or you may have heard the term civil society, not NGO, non-profit, for those in countries where the private sector has had the most power, NPO, nonprofit organizations, not NGO, non-governmental organizations, as in countries where the government has all the resources. Those of us in the citizen sector working here, we don't want to define ourselves by what we're not government or not private sector. We want to describe ourselves by what we are. We are citizens in our countries. We are residents in our countries who can develop the skills, who should have the power and the right to improve our own societies. So this is the citizen sector. And since the 1970s, as institutions of democracy around the world were strengthened and laws were passed around the world to allow and protect citizens who start and grow organizations for the public good, the citizen sector has exploded in growth, power, and innovation. This enabling environment of laws and protection are really critical. And there are countries where it's almost impossible for a citizen to come up with an idea, to build up that idea, to attract resources, to scale up that idea and spread it throughout society. One example is China. It's very difficult. It seems to be very threatening to the powers that be when someone working in consumer rights or in housing rights or in migration, internal migration rights, tries to build an organization and spread that in order to change society. It just has not worked. So we can talk about this citizen sector by also talking about definition of entrepreneur in general, because I think many of us think the word entrepreneur, no, we're not going there yet. We're going back, Mary, sorry. Talking about the citizen sector. The entrepreneur comes from a business term originally over 200 years ago. I think it was a French word originally, as meaning one who takes into hand. And over 2 years ago, it was defined by the French economist Jean-Baptiste Say to characterize a special economic actor, not someone who simply opens a business, but someone who shifts economic resources out of an area of lower and into an area of higher productivity and greater yield. Joseph Schumpeter characterized the entrepreneur as the source of what he called, quote unquote, creative destruction necessary for major economic advances. I think you would recognize the examples of these people: Henry Ford, creating the assembly line; Steve Jobs, who decided that computers did not need to be residing only in this one big room that had to be specially cooled and heated. And but he thought all of us should have a computer in our homes. And from 1981, we had those little boxes with the little disk drive you could push your floppy disk into. And that changed so much in this country and in the world. But in 1980, a new change agent was recognized. And we call this change agent a leading social entrepreneur. And social entrepreneurs play analogous roles in education, healthcare, environmental protection, disability, and many other fields as those business entrepreneurs played in business. So you can see that our vision and the organization that started all of this by a social entrepreneur named Bill Drayton, Ashoka pursues vision of highly competitive citizen sector with rapidly improving productivity. So what you would see is, starting over in the upper right, you do have competition. And in the citizen sector, there's a lot of competition. And our goal and our hope is that those with the best ideas and delivery will thrive. They will gain resources. They will get the best recruits to work there. They will have policy impact and attract media to explain what is this social innovation. And that productivity, just like in the private sector, but in the citizen sector, the problems of society are solved more quickly and more effectively. Citizen organizations become as adaptive and efficient as business enterprises. And then finally, the impact that citizen groups have increasing impact on systemic, social, and environmental challenges, which then has a positive effect in a kind of cycle where more people will enter this citizen sector, especially the most able. So what is a leading social entrepreneur? Mary, can you put the next slide? This term, social entrepreneur, describes an individual who conceives of and relentlessly pursues a new idea designed to solve society problems on a very wide scale, wide, affecting millions and millions of people, and deep by changing the system that undergird those problems. This definition includes two critical components. First, the social entrepreneur must seek to create impact on a wide societal scale. He or she will not rest until the new idea has been broadly adopted at the national and even international level. Second, the social entrepreneur must seek systemic change, defined as fundamental reform of existing societal systems and/or the creation of brand new ones. Now, the founder of Ashoka, Bill Drayton, he felt that this was a pretty rare person, this leading social entrepreneur, that there are probably 1 per 10 million population. So like in Thailand, where I was living, which had about 40 million people, each year we would expect to elect 4 fellows. But Bill also felt that these people were everywhere and they'd been around for a long time. They were just not recognized as such. So let's look at an early example. Mary, can we have Ms. Florence Nightingale? Florence Nightingale, when she was a child, she had an older sister who had a lot of dolls and loved pulling them apart in a rather aggressive way. But Florence became well known in her household for wanting to put them back together. She learned to sew, and she would sew all of the problems in the little dolls, and she would just get so excited about doing this, and everyone praised her for this. But what she really wanted to do as she grew older was to become a nurse, to take care of people. But the image of nurses was not a very high image. They were considered like lower class, and Florence was from an upper class family. They were considered ill-educated and like more like cleaning people. And her father forbid her to study this, but she studied on her own. And I just like to just share with you, she was devastated. Let's see, and when she was 25, she expressed a desire to work as a nurse in the Salisbury Hospital, but her father, who was a wealthy landlord, was informed of the low moral standards then associated with nursing. He forbade his daughter to take the position. But she was devastated, but she found ways to apprentice herself. On family trips to London and European capitals, she toured hospitals and slums and schools and workhouses. And when in 1853, at the age of 33, she was finally permitted to accept an unpaid position as superintendent of the Institution for the Care of Sick Gentlewomen in London, where she gained a reputation as an excellent administrator. And then war came, and you might find these places recently in the news, because what happened was there was a war in 1854. English soldiers were dispatched to Crimea on the north coast of the Black Sea to fight alongside Turkish forces at war with Russia. And she was, she sort of made her way into there by a family friend who was working in the War Department, and he knew of her previous work, said Sidney Herbert, who was Secretary of the War, and he asked her to take charge of the nursing in the military hospitals in Scutari, a district of Istanbul. And in 6 days, she assembled 38 nurses and departed for Constantinople. And that was the beginning of an amazing time, because water was tightly rationed. There was cholera, typhus, dysentery, and the army surgeons thought it was preposterous that women would take part in this and told them they couldn't. And so she ended up taking over the hospital there and going to the local market and getting what she needed, soap and bandages. And over the years from there, she reorganized military hospitals during the war. Then she went back, she started a medical school, the first medical school in the military. And then she established a nursing school, the very first nursing school, first in the military, and she established the Nightingale Training School for Nurses. She totally restructured the health system of the country. And she went on very little out in public, but just pushing and changing things. So that's Florence Nightingale, and she's a great, she certainly fit the original definition of entrepreneur, having increased the productivity or yield of healthcare resources by many orders of magnitude. And in addition to blazing a trail for nurses, Nightingale established standards for sanitation and hospital management that have shaped norms worldwide. I'd like to know from the audience, what adjectives, after hearing this about Florence, even today, mostly she's shown as, what was it called? The lady with the lantern, because during the war, she only had a kerosene lantern. And so sort of as a handmaid to the physician, or as, this woman who went out there and did good work, but was not very dynamic. And after hearing about her life, I'd like to know what words you would use to describe her. How would you see her fitting within society and within this earlier definition I gave of a social entrepreneur? I can't see you all, so I can't call on anyone. Oh, Robin says unstoppable. And Carolyn, dedicated. Judy, persistent and unwilling to accept. I can't see the rest of it. Willing to accept the norm.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Anybody else have anything you'd like to unmute yourself and just throw in?
Not intimidated.
Yes, right. And so now you're getting to really the qualities of a leading social entrepreneur. A second kind of historical example I'd like to give you is Gandhi, and not the part of Gandhi, the wonderful part of Gandhi of encouraging the Indians to be proud of the things that are produced in India during the colonial period. But I think Gandhi in 1930 with the Salt March, I think more than anything, it is considered what brought down the British Empire in India and allowed India to gain its independence. His nonviolent resistance and his Salt March, how he organized so many, 60,000 Indians, I think, to march from the central part of India across to the sea. And it was illegal then for people in the colonies, people in India, to collect salt from their own oceans and to use that salt. And so Gandhi understood something very deep, his intuition, that in the past there were lots of rules in societies, but with the more modern environment and also the huge increase in populations, rules were no longer enough for society to operate. And that what was very, very important, Gandhi saw, was empathy. And Gandhi organized the people to march And so many thousands, tens of thousands marched that the media was drawn to this, not just the Indian media, but the European media. And they were following Gandhi in his march to the sea. And what happened was when they got to the sea, they started collect the people, these peasants, these people, well, from all walks of society. They started taking salt from the sea and the military, the British military started coming and beating them. And a whole wave would come toward the sea and they would be beaten and they would not react. They would give no resistance. And then they would be taken away by their friends and another wave of 1,000 would come. And this happened over day after day after day. And what happened was the media showed these newsreels at theaters all over England. And the people were horrified. And within just a few months, the decision was made in Parliament to begin the process of independence. So Gandhi, what was most interesting to Bill Drayton, looking and starting Ashoka, well, actually, when he was in college, he studied Gandhi, were Gandhi's how-tos. How did Gandhi craft his strategy? How did he build his institutions? How did he market his ideas? Gandhi fully engaged the details of politics, administration, and implementation. His greatest insight, as I was mentioning, was recognizing early in the 20th century that a new type of ethics was emerging in the world, and ethics grounded not in rules, but in empathy. He saw that what you've got to do is make people face up to the fact that they are not treating people equally. Once you do that, they can't continue doing it and still respect themselves. Excuse me. How did he do it? The salt marched 241 miles to the sea with 60,000 people. So Bill Drayton, who in grade 4 started a newspaper on civil rights and studied Gandhi and the Emperor Ashoka from the 3rd century BC, and Jean Monnet, the architect and driving force behind unification of Europe. Bill is a historian, a lawyer, and an environmentalist by education and experience, and he came up with the proposition that there's nothing more powerful than a new idea if it is in the hands of a social entrepreneur. And leading social entrepreneurs play a leading role, a leading, unique, and vital role in driving change. He saw in 1980 that the historic moment had arrived. He established Ashoka Innovators for the Public. He named it after the Emperor Ashoka, a practical creator on as giant a scale as anyone in history. Ashoka realized the economic power of the continental scale and empire, and he used that power for social purposes. Ashoka was established in 1981 when Bill was awarded one of the first MacArthur Genius Grants so that he could quit his job at the EPA, where actually he didn't have to quit because Reagan fired most of the leadership of the EPA in 1980. And Ashoka was established as the Global Association for and by social entrepreneurs. And today there are 3,600 fellows in 90 countries. So Ashoka was seen as a global profession, the world's first and largest professional associations, it remains today, of social entrepreneurs, as a new paradigm of international development. Not my former bosses like Jeff Sachs at the Kennedy School flying in and out of countries and telling people what to do, but that the best ideas, the most sustainable ideas come from within a society. And if the people with those ideas and the entrepreneurial spirit can be supported and invested in, that they will create lasting change. It's a new paradigm of philanthropy. Instead of charity, which much of philanthropy was based on, this is investment. And it's an investment in a human being. And Ashoka Fellows, when they are elected, have a 3-year financial investment they are offered, which allows them to quit the job they've been doing as a teacher in one school or a lawyer in one firm or a doctor or a nurse or an environmentalist, to quit that job and focus full-time on their idea. Let's see. And the overall vision of Ashoka is that these leading social entrepreneurs will become models to the whole society, that if you can see, if you can see them, one of them like Bill doing something new, you can say, oh, maybe I could do something in my community, in my society, to improve society. So the vision of Ashoka is everyone a change maker. Could we have the next slide, please? So here we're coming from history to today's world. And it's best to understand social entrepreneurs by introducing you to them. In the middle of this picture is Flavia Agnes. And I can show you through Flavia how Ashoka works. Ashoka identifies and supports the world's leading entrepreneurs, learns from the patterns of their innovation, and mobilizes a global community that embraces these new frameworks to build an everyone a change maker world. The story of Flavia Agnes. Flavia was born in 1947, and she was raised by an aunt in India because her father had a job and took the rest of the family to Yemen to work for a living. From 47, when she was 20 years old in 1967, she had an arranged marriage, as many, even today, in India experience. She was in her marriage. She had 3 children, and she had a husband who beat her all the time. And she was in a terrible, terrible situation in this marriage. She had no means of breaking out of this marriage, she felt, because she had no economic power. She had a high school leaving exam, so she'd gotten maybe to age 17 in high school, and that was it. And she felt very trapped and felt hopeless. Around the time, and this is true of many social entrepreneurs, everyone, what's really important is the individual sees the historic moment that is ripe for their vision of how society can be different and for the idea that they're beginning to develop. Flavia first understood that she had to free herself from this marriage, which was destroying her physically and emotionally. And at the time, in 1980, when she started, the feminist movement had just begun to flower in India. And there was in Bombay, where Flavia lived, there was the very first rape center and women's shelter. She finally got the courage to flee, although she knew she couldn't take her children with her. And she fled to this domestic abuse shelter. And she felt so grateful to be safe and no longer being beaten. But over the next couple of years, she realized that no woman in this situation could be free until they had some economic ability or could participate in the national economy through work. And so she was raised a Christian, and she went to her church and she asked for sewing machines and was given 4 sewing machines. And with those sewing machines, she taught other women and improved her own ability to sew and started doing piecemeal work in sewing and having those goods that they made.
Recording in progress.
Sold. But after a while, she also figured out that this was never going to give her real economic independence. This was very small amounts of money. How could she ever get her children? How could she ever make enough to support her children? So she had a friend who was an electrician, and she badgered him to introduce her to the head of the electrical union. And she got there, And she finally convinced the electrical union in Mumbai today, Bombay then, to admit women into the electrical union and to train women to be electricians. Now here was real money who could, and she was able then to get her economic independence. She went to the court, she tried. Was I muted? Hello?
Yeah, you were muted briefly. So
Okay. So did I get her into the electrical union?
yes,
Okay.
yes.
So the next thing she did was she tried to petition through the shelter to get a divorce, and she was refused and refused and refused. So she came to the conclusion that economic empowerment is one thing, but the problem is in the laws and in the policy. And so she took the money she made in the electrical union and in the sewing, and she was admitted to a bachelor's of sociology program in 1984. Remember, she just started in 1980. 1984, a BA in sociology. 1988, a law degree. And 1997, eventually, she had an MPhil. And she was admitted to taking cases to the Supreme Court of India. She started in 1988, she took her first case to the Supreme Court, and she formed an organization called Majlis, which is a legal and cultural resource center. She, in 1997, Oxford Press published her Law and Gender Inequality book, that countering the demand for a uniform civil code on marriage. And she has focused, she brought about legislative reform in the law of divorce applicable to Christians. She then worked on Muslim law to make it part of, so that there was Islamic law, and then there was also civil law. And then a man could no longer say in India, I divorce you, I divorce you, I divorce you, and get a divorce. Then she started a campaign defending the rights of bar dancers and represented them through a public interest law. She has done so many things, and her organization Majlis has now taken on, and they offer legal services to women, and they have taken on 50,000 cases in India, plus taken the cases to the Supreme Court. So apart from active litigation and public campaigns, through a convergence model involving the judiciary, police, hospitals, the Department of Women and Child Development of Maharashtra, they provide social, legal support to women on issues such as sexual abuse, domestic violence, matrimonial rights. And they also do the research and collect the statistics and use this to change the laws in Parliament. So there's Flavia. I can tell you another little story about Flavia, that in 1980, let's see, I wasn't at the Kennedy School age, about 1987, she was invited to a women's conference in Boston. And I lived in Lexington, Massachusetts then, and I'd started the Boston chapter for Ashoka. And so she stayed with me, and I would take her to different shelters around Boston. And one day we were at a shelter in Cambridge, and the women were talking about their lives, and she was listening. And one of them said they had a big problem because they got an injunction, a restraining order against the husband, but he had the keys to the house, so he'd just come back in at night and beat her again. And Flavia, who'd been very quiet up to that point, said, well, you know, right from the beginning, we have trained women to be locksmiths. And the first thing we do when there's a restraining order is send in one of our women to change every lock in that building. And the other amazing thing to me, when she was staying in my house, she saw the bathroom in my house, which had a jacuzzi. And we were talking, she said, you know, I've never had a bath. And I mean, most of her life when she started, it was just a bucket over the head, but she had never had a bath. And so I said, oh boy. So we got the bath salts, and we got the the jacuzzi going, and we got everything. And she spent about 2 hours in that bath and had really wonderful time. And our friendship grew and grew over the years, and we're still very, very close friends. So that's Flavia. And I knew this talk could go on for hours and hours, and I want to give you time, but can we go to the next slide? Ashoka tries to find the fellows at this time in their life cycle. People in their kind of apprenticeship are learning the field, developing the entrepreneurial ability, and then they get to this point that we call takeoff, and these terms are also used in business, where you're designing and refining and implementing the solution, and it's starting to attract resources, but you really need to get to that next stage. And that's where Ashoka tries to insert itself. We find the fellows through nominating committees, through working with journalists all over the world who write on social issues, sometimes academics, although often they're not so great at real life. But when they are, they're spectacular. And we find nominators, and then our wonderful colleagues in each place, in each country, will go follow the person around for 3 or 5 days. How did you come up with this idea? Where are you going with it? How are you going to spread it? And if they think it's a new idea, then they go back to the office and they call people who are experts, like if it's in medicine, is this idea efficacious and safe? And then if they really think this is a solid candidate, somebody from outside the country representing the global Ashoka comes and interviews each candidate for 5-6 hours, sometimes 2 days. And if we believe that they fit our criteria, which, can we have the slide on the criteria? Did we have that before? Well, anyway, the criteria, we have 4 criteria. First, the knockout test. Is it a new idea? And what distinguishes the candidate's approach from the way the problem has been handled before? Has this idea been tried before? What happened? Why did it fail? And does this person, here we get to what we mean by entrepreneur. We don't mean enterprise. We don't mean enterprise. We mean, does this person have a track record of starting things? You don't suddenly wake up when you're 50 years old and decide you're a social entrepreneur. You're going to solve a big problem. Occasionally you do, if something really traumatic happens in your life and you're compelled to do something. But usually they start very young. They are very creative in problem solving, in goal setting. They're as concerned with how they're going to do it as what they're going to do. And it takes shape over years and iterative process. We do not mean someone who can get things done. Lots of people are good at getting things done, but they don't change the pattern. Or is this person a good administrator? That helps, but that's not what we're looking for necessarily. That's part of it. Or a good manager, that certainly helps too. They have to be determined to stick with it. And then, so there's creativity in goal setting and problem solving. There's the new idea. There's the social impact of the idea, which is the one criteria that's not about the person, but it's about the power of this idea. If this person goes away in 20 years to Mars or somewhere, would the idea be strong enough to continue building and spreading? And then the last and very important, another knockout idea is ethical fiber. If you think of yourself in a situation you really don't like being on the top of a mountain and looking down, or having a snake slither around you, think of something that really makes you anxious, and then think of this person as you've gotten to know them. Would you trust them? Because there are enough charlatans in the world, we don't want to support them. And also to spread an idea, if people don't trust you, they won't follow you. So it goes through our colleagues, it goes to a second opinion. That was my role. And then it goes to the global board. Then it goes to a local panel, a national panel of other social entrepreneurs who again interview each candidate and decide by consensus if this person fits all these criteria. And finally, it goes to the global board to make the final decision. So I'm gonna try to stop now, although, as you know, I could talk. My role there was about the fellowship, and could we have the fellowship slide? These are all the things Ashoka does, in addition to the 3-year stipend for the fellow to basically cover their living costs. We have all of these different programs that fit together. And I'll just mention one because I'm especially proud of it. A collaboration among fellows. We started a fellow protection program. Over the years, we have lost 2 fellows to assassination, and 1 fellow's child was killed because of the father's work in Pakistan. 1 in Brazil, Chico Mendes, who many of you may have heard of, in the Rubber Tappers Union. And we realized that sometimes being a social entrepreneur is very dangerous. So we created this program with fellows to right at the beginning, as they are elected, to help them understand that what they are doing, and that they know it. A lot of people don't like what they're doing. It's shaking things up. It's changing the system. So now we have ideas for them to stay safe, to be aware of things, aware of their environment, aware when they're getting threats, who they can go to within their country, and within the fellowship to help them. And on occasion, we've had to get fellows very quickly, within 4 hours, out of their country and into safety in another place. So we have a family program, Ashokitos, for the kids of fellows, because sometimes people like Gandhi's children don't understand what they're doing and feel that there's a lot of loss to have a parent who is a social entrepreneur and always obsessed with their work. Okay, I promise now, 10 minutes. We will have we have some time for questions.
Well, thank you very much, Carol. Where does the money come from? Let's start with the basics.
Well, here we get back to Pierre Midyar and people like him. Ashoka has never taken a penny from any government because we want this to be an independent sector and an independent organization. And also in many countries, taking money from the government is not acceptable for the citizen sector and could endanger them as far as their work, not personally necessarily. So we have looked to business entrepreneurs like Pierre Midyar, who founded eBay, like Narayana Murthy in India, who started Infosys Company, and it was the first Indian company on the New York Stock Exchange, and he's very proud of the global thing, because they understand what it's like to be at that early stage. And many of them are really excited. They say, I've had all opportunities to meet other business entrepreneurs at all these professional meetings, but I've never met someone who's applying the same kind of personality that I recognize in myself towards improving society. So we have Pierre Midyar. There's a man whose name I'm forgetting now in Latin America. George Soros gave us the investment for the entire launch of Africa and Central Europe when we wanted to start in Central Europe. And we work very closely. Also, we've helped them in other ways, very personal. For example, we started a program for the children of our investors, because they're saying, you know, sometimes my kids say, I don't know if anybody likes me because of me, or if they like me because my dad is Bill Gates or one of the Hewletts or the Packards. And so we started this program where the kids have opportunities to go and follow around an Ashoka Fellow in some country and see where they could find their own way. Especially those who are going to be going into the foundations like Hewlett or Packard Foundation or others. So our money comes from, we also take from foundations, and we have programs like Ford Foundation sees Ashoka as its incubator. Ford Foundation only invests at that once they've gotten to almost a national level. and so they could get a Ford grant. But before that, they don't know how to find the people. And so they look to Ashoka to find people at the early stage, and then they come in with grants later on. And in fact, they have worked with us on establishing a human rights program where we have investment now to find more human rights fellows around the world with the Ford Foundation. Other examples, yeah, those are I think the best foundations, but private sector and foundations and individual contributions from people like you, as PBS would say, who get excited about Ashoka and want to be part of it.
Carol, what examples do you have of Ashoka Fellows in the US?
Well, one I think that some of you might be quite interested in is our newest fellow, and she was very early in her life cycle, Katrina Spade. Katrina Spade grew up in New Hampshire, I think. Her father was a doctor, and she used to follow him around. When she got into high school, she would shadow him to see what medicine was all about, because everybody else in her family was a doctor. And she was thinking of medicine, and she would see people at the very end of their lives. And she would see, a couple of times she was with her father when a patient died, and she would listen to the family and how they were in grief. And she thought she wanted to do something about late in life and about death and what happens. And so she decided not to become a doctor. She became an architect. And I love this because Ashoka Fellows are so interested in structures and structuring society. And so she went to architecture school, and she also started studying the funeral industry and about the environmental consequences of the funeral industry and embalming, and about how in America we've separated ourselves so much from life to death issues. And she started an organization, and she calls it Recompose. And because she was also worried about cremation. It puts a lot of pollution into the air. So Recompose, she has created in Seattle a place where a person's family can have the body sent to recompose, and they do not use any embalming fluids or anything. They're even studying the mercury in teeth of people and doing all of these chemical studies. But what they do is the family can come there if they wish, and they can bathe their loved one like people in countries all over the world sometimes do, or they can wrap the person in the muslin, and then they can walk up this kind of ramp that goes to the top of this structure she created, and the body is put into a pod, and the body over the next 4 months goes lower and lower with these processes that she's developing with universities around the United States of non-toxic processes. And after 4 months, we're compost. And if a family wants, they can take home the compost and use it, but other families donate it. And with the compost they've already received by becoming legal in Washington State, they are composting a forest and reviving a forest outside Seattle. She's now legal in Washington State and in Colorado. And I know there's some interest from Mary and others in these end of life series they're having, and Judy's and Mary were talking to me about it too. And I'm sure she would love to come to Washington, DC, or at least talk to people in Washington, DC about this idea. And I am signing up. So I hope this is legal in Washington.
Carol, that you are Bill Matuszewski's dream. That you know this person.
Shirley Rosenfeld's got a question.
Carol, this is really very interesting. And as a newcomer to social entrepreneurship, as a person, Let me ask you, you've pointed out, I would say Ashoka kind of nominates the Nobel Prize of social entrepreneurs. That's
Yes.
how I would, based on your description. But these are extraordinary individuals.
Yes.
And does Ashoka or any organization, to your knowledge, work on disseminating this awareness and these lessons, what works and what doesn't work in social entrepreneurship more broadly, so that, let's say, our young people coming of age, that much as people think about recycling now that they didn't 35 years ago, this becomes part of your everyday experience, your awareness of how you in small ways could do this, rather than the
Exactly, which is the whole vision. And I'm glad you asked that, because we haven't done a good enough job. Other people who have taken Ashoka has mentored the Skoll Foundation that you see every night if you watch PBS. It has mentored Echoing in Green, which is for younger people. So it has spread in that way. David Gergen, I saw, just had something, an article in the New York Times about the new leadership, and he talked about social entrepreneurs. They're in universities now. Universities can do a certification to become change maker universities. And my daughter-in-law, who's a teacher at Peabody School preschool, but my granddaughter goes to Watkins, and they've just started a social entrepreneurship program. And so it's going all over the United States and many other countries. But it's a good question. Yeah, these are sort of the, well, like Bill got a MacArthur, one of those MacArthur awards. And so our fellows are at that level. But many of them, like Muhammad Yunus, do become very famous with a Nobel Prize in economics for starting microfinance. We do a measuring effectiveness study, but I have to say that for me, that was one of the weakest parts of Ashoka. We were not good at the dissemination of what we do, and more importantly, what the fellows do. But I think it's improving. Almost every university, well, I won't say every university, so many universities now in the United States and other places around the world, India, they have degrees, they have programs, you can major in social entrepreneurs. Stanford is one of the big leaders, and it has a journal on social innovation, and they highlight a lot of Ashoka fellows. The World Economic Forum created a program to invite, it started just with our fellows, and now it's branched out to others, so they can have an interaction with the business and government people at the World Economic Forum. But much more needs to get done.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank
Well,
you.
and thank you indeed to Carol. It's been an enlightening and inspiring hour with you, Carol. I'm sure people will have a lot of questions to ask you privately as they meet you on the street or on a bicycle.
On a bicycle.
Okay. And remember, all of you, that we will take off July and August as we usually do. We'll pick up again in September and watch for the announcement of the whole autumn programs. So thank you, everybody. And thank you, Carol.
Thank you. Thank you so much.